Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone and I'm one of the principal security analysts at SecurityMetrics, coming to you today from Dublin, Ireland. PCI Community Meeting Europe is in Dublin this year. Feeling very honored to be able to speak to many of the people who are involved in this community meeting and let you know what it's all about. Today I'm very excited to have with me today two representatives from EMVCo and PCI SSC to tell us about the ongoing collaboration between these two very interesting groups. Thank you for joining me today and welcome to the podcast. Would you like to start? Introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Arman Aygen and I'm the Director of Technology at EMVCo.
Andrew Jamieson, I'm the VP of Solutions within PCI SSC.
Terrific. So can we start with just a general background? What is EMVCo? What do you do?
Okay, so EMVCo is an industry technical body that defines card payment specifications. So when you have your payment card, got a little chip in it. So that's one of the first specifications that we came up with. And you can ask why it matters. Basically, thanks to the global interoperability and testing that we provide and the compliance that we provide on top of these cards, then you know that wherever you go around the world, you know that your card is going to work and you can trust it to work. So we define all the functional requirements as well as security requirements related to that. And then we evolved quite a fair bit from there into contactless, that derived into wearables and mobile payment, as well as remote commerce. So we have EMV payment tokenization, 3DS, secure remote commerce.
And so you mentioned being part of the PCI collaboration with EMVCo. Can you tell us more about that position and we'll kind of launch into how it all works together?
Sure, no problem. So as Arman said, EMVCo kind of set the specifications for how these cards, how these what we call payment instruments work. When you go somewhere, I live in Australia, and so I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember traveling places, and my card from Australia wouldn't work if I traveled to the US or to Europe, where I am now. But now all that works, and it's because of the wonderful work that EMVCo has done in specifying how you have these cards with chips on them, how you have data on your mobile phone that you can use to make payments. But that's at the functional level. That's how it will work in terms of the data going back and forth and determining how much you're going to pay and where it's going to go from an issuer point of view. But then from PCI's point of view, that data also needs to be secured. And so you can think of the collaboration that we have. The EMVCo side is really around the payment instruments, how they work, how they talk, if you like, to the payment terminals, how the communication works online with the secure remote commerce, for example. And then from PCI SSC's point of view is how that data is secured at the point of acceptance, during the processing, and as it's transmitted, stored, and processed throughout that transaction lifecycle, all the way through the acquirer and the issuer, through the merchants and so forth. So one of them's functional and security on the chips and security on the instruments. And then from PCI's point of view, it's how we secure the ecosystem in which those instruments are used. So it's really important we collaborate together because one is only part of the whole, if you like. One side, sure, it'll work, but you still need to protect that data. And from our side, we don't specify how these things work. We just specify how they're secured. And so if you want to, like me, travel to Dublin and have a Guinness, you need to have a card that's going to work, and EMVCo help with that.
So you also mentioned 3DS.
Yes.
And that is, I believe, an online...
It's the authentication and that you have. So to follow on the story started by Andrew, as we make sure that the card is actually a legitimate card that you can use. And that's done through the cryptographic exchange that happens between the card and the terminal. And then we have the verification that you are the rightful owner of that card. That's where the PIN comes into play. And in remote commerce, because you don't have that face-to-face interaction, you need another method in order to do that verification, authentication of the cardholder, because you are sending basically your card information. And then to validate that it's really you making that transaction, there is like a one-time authentication that can be done in very different ways. And to follow on that story, when that card data is transmitted to the acquirer and the merchant, it needs to be protected because it's compromised. The impact can be really big.
Right.
And this is the beginning of the collaboration that we have. So basically, they will be looking at how the 3DS information is being protected, how the keys are being managed and exchanged. Then we have the payment tokenization. So if the card data is compromised, it reduces significantly the impact of it because it's limited to a specific domain of use, and so forth. Yeah.
So our listeners are maybe 60% U.S. based, and then others are more international. And so a lot of the people who are going to hear this podcast probably have not heard of 3DS before because it's not widely adopted in the U.S. But I think in parts of the world it's actually required.
There's a regulatory requirement. So the way I like to position this is that we have different ways of looking at how this is being managed. At EMVCo, we have absolutely no mandate on anything. So we make the technology available, and depending on the use cases and the business cases of the people, they may or may not use certain functionalities that are being provided. In Europe, it's chip and PIN by default. So you put your card and it will ask for the PIN. If it's contactless, high-value transaction, it will ask for the PIN in order to do that cardholder verification. In the US, it's not systematic to have the PIN. And the same way for remote commerce, there's a regulatory requirement in Europe and in some other countries which says you need a strong customer authentication to reduce the fraud of remote commerce. Especially during the pandemic, remote attacks have increased and e-commerce fraud has increased significantly. And one way to reduce that fraud is by doing that 3DS second factor authentication or verification of the authentication of the transaction. We work also in non-regulated environments, and then the US Payment Forum has also made a comment about how the merchants that are using, or the issuers that are using this requirement for this authentication are also reducing the amount of fraud that's happening. And then there is another way to look at it. Instead of looking at it from a regulatory, non-regulatory perspective, there's a trusted versus untrusted environment. And that comes down to the different demographics on how people behave or different countries look at those transactions.
Right.
There are some countries where if you don't get that notification to confirm that transaction, they get edgy. It's like, oh, what's going on? That transaction went too smoothly and I was
Feels
not
sketchy.
challenged. Yeah, exactly. See, you feel it. That's right as well. And that could depend also on the amount of the transaction. You may not want to do it on like the small amounts, or it depends on the use cases. And
like when people stopped asking for a signature on credit cards, there was a point where, not even just fairly recently, if it was under a certain amount, you don't need to put anything in. We accept that. Basically, the acquirer accepts that risks level. But some people are still uncomfortable with want that reassurance that my card payment went where it was supposed to go.
The perception of control.
Exactly.
And I like to use that word, perception of control, because it's the banks are really good at monitoring your behaviors, how you're doing, how you're spending, and they will call you if there is something funky happenings, like you're spending suddenly 10,000 on the holidays. Like, are you going on a honeymoon? You were married 10 years ago. It's like, what's going on here?
My favorite card pause moment, I guess, was I was in Singapore buying tickets to a zoo in New Zealand, and with my U.S. card, and gosh, that got flagged. So with that base, thank you so much for that explanation. I think that's very informative. So now we bring in PCI and the standards that the SSC has established for various elements of that. Can you help us understand? So as you said, there is a standard, but there's not an enforcement. You don't have to use all of these features. It's not required, but it is available to people. Is that where PCI comes in with the security pieces of that, or
not exactly? So EMVCo and PCI SSC are quite similar in that we produce standards, and whether people use those standards, whether there's enforcement around those standards, that's entirely up to other bodies, the payment brands, the compliance accepting entities who might use them. But what does happen, so we talked about 3DS, for example, talked about TSP, we can talk about just DSS from a broad point of view. All of these standards, that there's data and information that's coming from the EMVCo protocols that needs to be secured. So, for example, with 3DS, there's information that's being used as CVMs or cardholder verification methods. So, in the traditional environment, and people refer to chip and pin, for example, as EMVCo, but chip, yes, and there's some context around that, but PIN is what we call a CVM, a cardholder verification method. You can have signature as a cardholder verification method. You can have literally what's called no CVM, which is where you just tap your card or insert your card or swipe your card if it's a magnetic stripe. No CVM, then that's fine in some context, once again, depending on who's accepting those transactions. And with 3DS, what that is, that's applying CVMs, cardholder verification methods, into an online context. So all these things, the signature, the PIN, even no CVM, they're used in face-to-face card-present transactions. With 3DS, we have these CVMs, these cardholder verification methods, they're used online. And it could be a password, it could be a one-time token, there's transaction unique data that's included in that as well. And all of that data is specified within the EMVCo specs, but needs to be secured in the same way that when you enter your PIN on a POI device, and that PIN might be sent through your acquirer to your issuer, that needs to be secured in the chain. And we have a standard from that for PCI SSC called PCI PIN. It talks about how the cryptography works and how the key management works. And we have standards for the devices, PCI, PTS, POI. We have, in the online context for 3DS, PCI 3DS standards, core and SDK, which talk about how you secure that transactional data, the cryptographic keys, and the 3DS data that's used as that CVM. So it's not about kind of one side is regulated or mandate and one side is not. It's like one side's functional, one side's security, and once again, if it's up to the compliance accepting entities what they do with those standards.
It's really different sides of the same equation. Yeah. So when we look at the payment from end to end, the information, the cryptogram and the PIN that is stored on the physical card, that's where EMVCo is involved in making sure that's secured and that you can't actually go and extract that information from the card. But when it's stored on the other side, that's when PCI gets involved in order to make sure that the organizations have all the different policies in place in order to make sure that that PIN cannot be retrieved or
That's great. This has been excellent clarity. This is a question that I get all of the time from people is, who's going to come after me if I don't do this? And they think that maybe PCI is an enforcing body, or that and now they might have thought that EMVCo is. So now understanding that these are standards, that they look at different things through different lenses. And then there are other groups that may or may not encourage compliance with it, depending on, like you said, 3DS regulatory in some areas, and the standard for PCI, your acquiring bank is going to want to see things, or if you're a service provider, your customer is definitely going to want to see some things. And so understanding that, I think, helps people know these standards are to help them get there, not to be in any way punitive or trying to hurt their business. So
yeah, and I think the goal from EMVCo's point of view is to make sure that people can, as I say, travel the world, use their payment cards in an interoperable, functional, and a way that can be secure in transactional point of view. And from PCI SSC, it's to make sure that all of that data that's being used is secured and managed securely. We're kind of two sides of the same coin, I would say. I don't know whether. I'd say it's not like heads and tails, or both heads, I would say, both tails. Maybe I don't know, maybe your tails.
Which one is the dark side of the moon?
I'm not really sure. Two sides of the same coin is what I'm saying.
How long have PCI and EMVCo been collaborating together? What's the history of this working together?
We've been working together for a long time.
It's not just a brand new thing.
It's definitely not just a brand new thing. It certainly exceeds the tenure of both Arman and myself. So I've been working with PCI SSC for almost 2.5 years now. Arman's been with EMVCo for just one. Funnily enough, we worked together in previous lives, so we've known each other for about 10 years now. And I think the collaboration
was already there.
10 years ago. Yeah. So
amazing.
It's for a very long time.
That's great. And so are there current efforts of developing things together or working together? What does that look like from a kind of either a project perspective or a day-to-day? How is that collaboration carried on?
There's monthly meetings that we have in order to keep each other up to date, and then some perspectives on what's happening in the payment space that we share between each other. When we initiate a new activity, we will also make the other party aware of it. And then we don't do these alone. So we have our advisors. PCI SSC has their advisors as well. And having that broad understanding of which organization is doing what is also very helpful for the wider industry. So Andrew came to one of our technical meetings in Singapore and did a rundown of what PCI is doing, what roles they play, and how we work together. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm here as well, in order to basically foster and nurture those collaboration and discussions on how we can better align going forward.
Yeah, so it's not like we work on each other's standards. We have quite clear remits, and we're independent organizations, and we generate our standards separately. But we have a collaboration role in making sure that we're not doing something that is going to cause friction on one side or another. We're keeping each other informed. We're making sure that we're aligned in where we're going in terms of how payments are maturing and what's happening in the payments landscape. Everything's changing quite rapidly at the moment. What's coming up that needs to be specified from a functional point of view. What's coming up that needs to be secured in terms of the data point of view. As Arman said, we have regular calls and meetings like this where we stand up on stage together and talk, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. This has been really informative. Just before we wrap things up, what is it that you would like people to understand about EMVCo, PCI, SSC, or the collaboration that we haven't covered yet?
I think the most important thing is that we are that two sides of the same coin. One is from a functional point of view. One is more of a security and procedural point of view. I think that a question that does come up quite often at the moment is around the mobile side of things, particularly mobile acceptance. And we'll be having a presentation on this later on today, both myself. EMVCo have specifications around, for example, how the NFC interface, the contactless interface on the phone, how well that works, how the card needs to be read a certain distance and so forth. I'm sure Arman could describe this better. It's all a functional side in terms of how it works. And from PCI SSC, we have security standards like MPOC that talk about once that data is read, how it's secured and transmitted and managed, and how the PIN might be secured and so forth. So it's that operational and security side that come together to create an overarching secure landscape for interoperable secure payments.
I think that is a really good example in terms of the payment acceptance on the mobile device. One of the things that we noticed is it's very well secured. There's been standards provided by PCI for quite a while, but the experiments are showing very fragmented user experience on the back of it. And one of the reasons for this is that in the past, you always had to have a little piece of dedicated hardware that were making sure that you had a seamless payment acceptance that works all the way up to 4 centimeters. Mm-hmm. And now you're using off-the-shelf devices. It could be industrial, it could be commercial, but they have not necessarily payment as a primary function, and they might not achieve the same level of seamless payment functionality. So we have looked at that in order to give that visibility to the industry in terms of how well different devices are performing with a reduced range. So we defined two ranges, like 2 centimeters or 1 centimeter. That's why I was getting closer to.
Because it works better if you
Yes.
lean.
It's
So to give an indication.
seamless
And
possible.
And this is how we work together and give that clarity to the market, because we had quite a few questions coming up. It's like, who does what and what do I need to do? And basically having this listed, if you're a merchant and you want to launch a mobile acceptance device, then you may have the understanding that if you choose this device, you may have that experience in that device, because it has not been tested. Basically, you're on your own. You don't know what you're going to get.
Well, this has been very informative. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, and I hope we get to speak again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.